All right, let's get started today. I wanted to start by reviewing some of the stuff that we talked about at the end of last time, which the piece by Bruce Kuklick should have helped you to understand and to put into context. The concept of type and anti-type is sometimes confusing to people. Remember, I said last time that the type should be considered to be something like the die that produces a coin, or the stamper that you ink and that produces the stamped image. It's almost like a reverse of the thing that is going to be produced. And it has no meaning really in and of itself. You don't care about either the die that produces the coin or the stamper. You care about what's produced. And in that sense, the type is not what we're interested in. It's the anti-type that we're interested in, the thing that the type produces, the thing, you might say, that is the fulfillment of the potential within the type. So here's a little bit about the etymology, which comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, right? And you can see that the definition is that which is shadowed forth or represented by the type or symbol. And they, in fact, use the idea of the die, and they talk about the way in which that's part of the etymology of the term. So once you get those things straight, type and anti-type. Type, when you're thinking about the way in which the term typological hermeneutics arose, it's a way of reading the Bible. It's a form of biblical exegesis in which the Old Testament is full of types which are fulfilled by the anti-types that are present in the New Testament. And of course, the anti-type of all anti-types is Christ himself. Later on, I suggested to you that when the Puritans come to the New World, they start to get away from what you might think of as strict or conventional notions of typological reading and start to use it as a method of interpreting their entire world. All right, so that is, in which they think the Bible as a whole now becomes the type, and they and their experiences, in some sense, are now the anti-types that the types of the Bible have foreshadowed and which can be interpreted in that way. Let me give you a quick example of this that comes from some reading that actually isn't, I don't think was for today, but we'll take a look at it. It's in the Norton Anthology. It's from the Journal of John Winthrop. And this is on page 159 of your text. And you can see how even the littlest thing can be subjected to a typological reading, although this, I guess, is a somewhat unusual event that therefore begs to be interpreted typology. It's the little section of Winthrop's journal on 159 that's called Overcoming Satan, July 5th, 1632. At Watertown there was, in the view of diverse witnesses, a great combat between a mouse and a snake. And after a long fight, the mouse prevailed and killed the snake. The pastor of Boston, Mr. Wilson, a very sincere, holy man, hearing of it, gave this interpretation, that the snake was the devil, the mouse was a poor, contemptible people, which God had brought hither, which should overcome Satan here and dispossess him of his kingdom. Upon the same occasion, he told the governor that before he was resolved to come into this country, he dreamed he was here, and that he saw a church arise out of the ocean, out of the earth, which grew up and became a marvelous, goodly church. Right? It's a strange little thing. How does we don't really know how the mouse defeats the snake. But you can see how something like that, immediately what they'll do is they'll go and think of a way to relate it to a kind of biblical reading, and then to take that biblical reading and apply it to their own situation. You might say that, in fact, this little journal entry has the structure of a sermon, as we'll see in a little bit. But in this case, the text comes not from the Bible, but from this little anecdote of the mouse and the snake. It's then read, interpreted by means of the Bible, and then applied to the situation of the Puritans themselves in the New World, which is exactly what Winthrop does in his sermon, as we'll see in a little while. So I just want you to see the ways in which typological thinking can work, and part of what we're going to do is investigate typology at work both in Bradford's history and in Winthrop's sermon. But first, let's make sure we've got some of these basic principles down. So John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion is a founding text for the Puritans, who we might say are one variant of the Calvinism that arose in the aftermath of Calvin's life and teaching. Calvin places particular emphasis on God's sovereignty, and therefore on the idea of fatedness, on providence, on the lack of human free will. And it's again something that we should keep thinking about. The way that the Puritans and others will interpret this is that, in fact, free will does exist in one sense, in the sort of earthly sense, the sense of individuals making choices. At any moment that you're given a choice, that for you is the exercise of your free will. The only catch is that God always already knows how you're going to choose in that moment. So in some sense, it's already destined or providential. Calvin wants salvation not at all to rest on good works, which are not dependable, but on God's eternal and unwavering will. So remember, I talked to you last time about the covenant of works and the covenant of grace, and the way in which, as a result of the fall, evil comes into the world, or at least the knowledge of evil comes into the world. This original sin is something for which Adam and his progeny are all responsible. It creates a debt to God through disobedience that can never be fully repaid, except that God sends down Jesus Christ to repay that debt, at least for some people. Right? So that is the only way that salvation can occur, through the agency of Christ for a few chosen people. So this leads Calvinists to a doctrine of what we call election, in which God has chosen some people for salvation and others are not chosen for salvation. And the Puritans believe that they are those who are elect. They are the ones that are chosen for salvation. So the principles that are discussed by Calvin in a philosophical way and not a schematic way are codified into this variant, which is created in a meeting of church elders, a synod, which takes place in Dort in Holland from 1618 to 1619, which is the year before the Bradford and the Pilgrims go from Leiden to the New World. And the Synod of Dort is directly addressing a heresy, an anti-Calvinist heresy that they are worried about, which is called Arminianism, after the Swedish philosopher Arminius, who emphasized the ability of singers to respond to do good or evil as they chose. And therefore, he said that they would earn their way into heaven through good works. And this is akin to other doctrines that you would find in other versions of Christianity, such as Catholicism. Good works have a certain kind of efficacy. Not so for the Puritans. There is no way to earn your way into heaven, and that's a result of the total depravity of humankind, right? So remember, we came up with this acronym TULIP last time to help you remember these 5 different principles that come out of the Synod of Dort. The idea that after original sin, human beings are all damned. They are totally depraved. Their election is unconditional. There's no strings on it. You might say there's no way of human intervention into the process of election. God has already decided, and there are no strings attached. It is limited. It's for some people and not for others. It's irresistible in the sense that you don't get to choose the time or the place when you receive grace. And when you receive grace, you really receive it. So that there's no resisting it at all. And once you have it, you have it. That's what they mean by the perseverance of the saints. Of course, what they also mean is that who the saints are is already set. God has already foreseen who the saints are going to be. So the elect already, you might say, have a place in heaven. The problem is they don't know, or they can't be sure. No one can be sure that he or she is among the elect. That wouldn't be so bad, except for the Puritans were also trying to create a polity, a social organization, and a politics that was based on these principles, in which they wanted, people who were full church members were going to be the ones who were running the society. So you need to figure out a way to make the earthly church, what they call the worldly church or the visible church, resemble as closely as possible the invisible church. So this is part of the Puritan project in the New World. Today we'll be talking a little bit about the startup or the setup of this project. Next time we'll be talking about the ways in which it starts to go awry, and in which compromises need to be. But if you hang on to that paradox, how can free will and fatedness exist at the same time for individual human beings? And what kind of code of conduct should come out of this? Right? I mean, if you're elect, What do you have, and you don't have to do anything good. Why should you ever do anything good? Why don't you get drunk all day, secure in the notion that you're going to be elect, when the time comes, you'll be converted, and you'll get your one-way ticket to the big, to heaven. Why wouldn't you want to act that way if you were a Puritan? Sure.
Maybe because the kind of person that God would choose to be elect wouldn't have the desire to be.
There you go. You see it as exact. She says the kind of person that God would choose to be among the elect wouldn't have the desire to do that. And that's right. You would sort of be calibrating what you wanted to do versus what you've been told the elect person actually does. So if you find yourself tending towards sinfulness and drunkenness, you would say, oh boy, that's not a good sign, is it? I better mend my ways. Maybe the signs will be changing at that point. Or maybe my desire to mend my ways is a sign that, in fact, I'm among the elect. People have sometimes asked, well, if you think that heaven is so great and things are really tough here on earth, why don't you just kill yourself and get up to heaven that much faster? Well, what's the problem with that? Yeah, you'd be committing a mortal sin, therefore, obviously, you weren't among the elect to begin with, so blah, blah, blah. The thing that you have to understand about these people, and that I will try to get across today, is that they are fundamentalists, and they really believe this stuff. They believe all of this. They want to believe it. It's not even a matter of wanting. They believe it, the Puritans among the Pilgrims, and they want it to work. So it's a problem for them when they come across paradoxes and contradictions, and they try to figure out ways to work forward. The idea always is that humans are fallible compared to God, but it doesn't lead them to a kind of cosmopolitan understanding of fallibility. In other words, they have faith about certain things. That faith is predicated on the idea that they are fallible, that only God is infallible, but there's no questioning the faith itself. So people wouldn't want to make false confessions of conversion. They want real conversions to happen. They want to be among the elect. And really, most of them believe that they will be among the elect. Okay, but we'll see next time that there are problems that occur in this. Again, I'm setting all this up. I want to refer you back to, again, where the end point of the course is going to be with Moby Dick, right? That one of the things that Melville sees in Hawthorne's writing is a continuing engagement with these Puritanic ideas. He calls it a touch of Puritanic gloom. And when we read Hawthorne, you'll remember, how many of you said you read The Scarlet Letter in high school? Okay. How many of you read The Custom House along with the short story that's called The Scarlet Letter? Do you even know what I'm talking about? The Scarlet Letter, in italics, is a book that contains two things. One of them is a sketch called The Custom House, a long sketch called The Custom House, which is introductory to a long tale, which in quotation marks is called The Scarlet Letter, which was intended to be only the first of a number of tales that were going to be included in this volume, but it got so long that it became the volume itself. Right? So there's the novel, The Scarlet Letter, has two parts. And in the first part, which I'm actually going to read more closely than you've probably used to, and in fact, in certain ways, it's more important to me than the long short story itself. Hawthorne has this moment of thinking back about what his ancestors are thinking about him as a writer. He thinks about the beetle-browed Puritans who are looking over him at their descendants. I'm thinking, what is he, a writer of stories? Why, he might as well be a fiddler, right? Writing doesn't rate. And that's part of the dilemma for the writer, like Hawthorne and Melville, right? Is there a sense in which there's something frivolous about writing? There's a larger sense in which you might say the culture, as we talked about in the first day, the culture is inclined to believe that certain kinds of writing are better than others, and imaginative writing, what we would now consider to be the literary, is not among those. So there's a kind of weird guilt, you might say, that Hawthorne and Melville are working through, but they're also trying to change the status of writing, to make arguments on behalf of both the importance and the worth, the moral worth, of a kind of writing that they want to do. Certain it is, Melville writes, that this great power of blackness in Hawthorne derives its force from its appeals to that Calvinistic sense of innate depravity and original sin. And now I think we're getting a sense of what that means, right? Where it comes from, how it's embedded in a larger cultural logic, from whose visitations in some shape or other no deeply thinking mind is always and wholly free. And remember, I pointed out all the kind of weird hedging that's on in there. But one of the things you might say is that in terms of that model of dominant, residual, and emergent, in the moment that we're looking at in the 17th century, when a new culture is being brought to the shores of the New World, it quickly becomes the dominant culture. Puritan New England dominates what is around it. And ultimately dominates the kind of line of American literary history that Hawthorne becomes part of. So what we see here, you might say, is the continuing residue of Puritanism in a time when Puritanism should have been pretty much left behind in the wake of the Enlightenment. Still, there's something. The Puritans were onto something. And maybe to now in the modern 19th century, we don't call it original sin, but we can't get away from it either. Something, some shape or other, has to be there in that place, occupying original sin, keeping us honest, making us sure of an understanding that we are limited beings. No man can weigh this world without throwing in something somehow like original sin to strike the uneven balance, right? So we're working our way towards that. Okay, so let's talk about Bradford now. And what I'm hoping to show you in some sense is how Bradford's text is an example of that typological way of looking at the world. And last time we were talking about that excerpt that's called Mort's, from a pamphlet that's called Mort's Relation that was prepared in 1620 or so, just after the Plymouth Puritans had settled. And it was thought to be co-written by Bradford and someone named Edward Winslow. And it's named Mort's Relation after a guy named George Morden, who brought it back to England and saw it through the press. Winslow would later publish his own pamphlet, which was called Good News from New England, about 4 years later in 1624. And so it's a tract that takes the form of a history, but as I suggested last time, it may perhaps be presenting an overly optimistic reading of the circumstances that they are encountering, but it's really not too much different from the promotional tracts that are more famously written by Captain John Smith, trying to encourage emigration from England and Europe into the New World. If you compare Mort's Relation to Smith's writing, many scholars believe that Mort's Relation provides a more matter-of-fact, slightly more trustworthy account of things than Smith's does. One thing to know about Bradford was that he was a great linguist. He became interested enough to learn Hebrew in his old age, and he knew Greek and Latin. But he wasn't at all interested in native languages and cultures, as we will soon see. So that's one of the paradoxes, you might say, about Bradford. And I think when you read the history of Plymouth Plantation, one of the things you see is where this idea of virgin land starts to come from. You get the sense that, in some sense, the wilderness is pretty much deserted except for a bunch of savages, that really all the people that there are in the New World who matter are simply this small group of Puritans. And of course, that is a consequence of the way in which he's written the thing up. So he has often been described as writing in something that we might call the Puritan plain style. It seems to be just pretty matter of fact, right? And that's supposed to be one of the hallmarks of Puritanism. As we see next week when we get to Puritan poetry, the Puritans actually rewrite the book of Psalms. They retranslate them, trying to get away from the kind of poetical translation that they brought with them from England, to try to get to something that's closer. They go back to the Old Testament passage that suggests that if God tells the Israelites to create an altar for him, and it should not be of hewn or graven stone, right? Don't want anything carved. And Cotton Mather, Increase Mather, who writes the preface to this new translation, says, because God's altar needs not our polishings. It's enough by itself. So we don't want figurative language. We just want a plain style. But of course, one of the things to say about that is it's not exactly true, or rather, their language is very figurative. The thing is, it depends on a whole symbolic and figurative system that is the one that we're calling typology. So it's not a language that's full of rhetorical flourishes and metaphors, but it depends on a sign system, a system of symbols, which means that it's really anything other than simply plain. All right, let's take a look at the passage from Mort's Relation again. And I wanted you to keep track of the dates. And while you're at it, you should probably turn back now to the other thing I asked you to look at, which is on page 114 of Plymouth Plantation. And that's the corresponding passage. So what we basically see is that Mort's Relation turns out to be a kind of draft for the history. They're retelling the same events. One of the co-authors of Mort's Relation is the person who's writing this history of Plymouth Plantation. And at the time that he's writing this, he is the time he's recounting. Bradford is the governor of of Plymouth Plantation, and he's thinking back and retelling the story that's told here. So again, let's just take a look at it again, right? Wednesday the 6th of September, the wind coming east-northeast, a fine small gale we lose from Plymouth. The appearance of much comforted us, especially feeling so goodly a land and wooded to the brink of sea. It caused us to rejoice together and praise God that had given us once again to see land. And thus we were made our course south-southwest, purposing to go to a river 10 leagues to the south of the Cape. But at night, the wind being contrary, we put round again for the Bay of Cape Cod. And upon the 11th of November, we came to an anchor in the bay, which is a good harbor and pleasant bay, right? And we see all the stuff here. It's got all these different kinds of trees which are individually named. It's a big harbor where you can bring in 1,000 sail of ships. You have wood and water, the greatest store of fowl that we ever saw, right? And he goes on. As soon as we set ashore, 15 or 16 men well armed to fetch wood. We had none. They also go to explore. He repeats again how excellent it is, like the downs in Holland, but much better. The crust of the earth, a spit's depth. Black earth, wooded with oaks, pines, sassafras, juniper, blah, blah, blah. At night our people returned, but found not any person nor habitation, and laid their boat with juniper, which smelled very sweet and strong, and of which we burnt the most of the time that we lay there. Right? So it's a place where they see, it looks like it's kind of virgin land, at least at the start. It's got all these natural resources, it's wonderful, it's part, in other words, Mort's relation takes part in that discourse of wonder that we were talking about last time. But they didn't see anybody. Unlike Columbus, they don't find people innumerable, and it takes them a while to meet up with the natives. For a long time, if you read into Mort's relation, one of the things that you see is that they find kind of remnants of things that people would have left, but they don't meet people themselves. Now let's take a look in the Norton here, right? Chapter 9, of their voyage and how they passed the sea, and of their safe arrival at Cape Cod. So we see that the date is the same. It's September 6th. These troubles being blown over, and now all being compact together in one ship, they put to sea again with a prosperous wind, which continued diverse days together, which was encouragement unto them. Yet according to the usual manner, many were afflicted with seasickness, and I may not omit here a special work of God's providence. Right? So immediately you're getting this idea that there's something providential, good fate that God has seen. There was a proud and very profane young man, one of the seamen, of a lusty, able body, which made him the more haughty. He would always be condemning the poor people in their sickness and cursing them daily with grievous execrations, and did not let to tell them that he hoped to help to cast off half of them overboard before they had come to the journey's end, and to make merry with what they had. And if he were by any gently reproved, he would curse and swear most bitterly. But it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite this young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first that was thrown overboard. Ooh, we call that, what, cosmic irony or something like that. And you can see in that, that's God's providence, right? But there's just a little bit of vindictiveness in it. And that's something that we're going to be thinking about. What's the interplay of the charity that they're supposed to be pursuing and some of the other impulses that come along with having in your mind that you are a chosen people. Let's take a look at the middle of 115 here. And let's take a look at what we find. Being thus arrived in a good harbor, and brought safe to land, this is the first full paragraph on 115, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. And no marvel if they were thus joyful, seeing wise Seneca was so affected with sailing a few miles on the coast of his own Italy, as he affirmed that he had rather remained 20 years on his way by land than pass by sea to any place in a short time so tedious and dreadful was the same unto him. Right? So this isn't typology. This isn't citing the Bible. But it does have something in common with that. Again, it's that same kind of comparison that you see here. It's like the Downs in Holland, but much better. This is like the experience of Seneca, but much worse. And that's the kind of comparison that characterize the history of Plymouth Plantation. There's a sense in which what Bradford does is look back to the past as a way of showing how much worse the current chosen people have it. You think it was bad for them in the Bible? So much worse for us. A Seneca, he was a wise, revered Stoic philosopher. He complained about just a little bit of seasickness, so much around, just sailing around that Italy, that he never wanted to get in a boat again. But look what we did. We sailed all the way across the Atlantic. So much the worse for us, right? And then there's kind of a moment that Bradford takes here. Right here after that. And it's a signal moment, a moment that in fact asks you to highlight it. And he's pausing rhetorically, and he asks us to pause. And it's worth looking at. But here I cannot stay but make a pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition. And so I think will the reader too, when he well considers the same. One of the things you can see is there's a kind of awareness of a readership here. And that's in part because Bradford is writing this in 1630, when Winthrop's group of Puritans is about to arrive. As we'll see, that group of Puritans doesn't have exactly the same understanding of Calvinism that this group of Puritans does. There's no guarantee at this moment that the Puritan mission or the Puritan civilization here in Plymouth is going to survive. So Bradford is both describing and writing a work that's clearly of advocacy with a future reader in mind. And some people would say that future reader is in fact his people's own progeny, thinking about ways in which they are going to be justifying what they've done to future generations and using that justification as a way of inspiring those future generations to continue the project on. So he's aware of a reader. And here he actually addresses the reader. I think you're going to be amazed, reader, if you pause, as I am doing, to take stock and think about the situation. Being thus past the vast ocean, and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, as may be remembered by that which went before, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. And one of the things to say right here is that this is taking place in the aftermath of the third chapter, which talks about the Holland experience, and some of those chapters which talk about it after that. I gave you a tiny little excerpt from that. It's on the Blackboard site. If you haven't taken a look at it, take a look at it. It's a couple of paragraphs long. But one of the things it does is it makes a set of comparisons within Holland where there are towns ostensibly for succor. But one of the things that you find is that Holland is just as treacherous in many ways. It's a hospitable place, it seems civilized, but it's no good for the Puritans. People are against them. They're being persecuted even there, right? So you might say that that's ratcheting up the stakes again. Even the towns that were helping them weren't such great towns. Here, don't even have that. It is recorded in Scripture as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked companies that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them. And you'll see here that this comes in the Acts of the Apostles, right? That book of the New Testament that's written by Luke, which talks about the kind of the immediate missionary work that goes on in the aftermath of Christ's crucifixion. So the apostles go out, as these current saints are doing, and they go out and meet a bunch of barbarians and try to convert them. But guess what? Those barbarians gave them refreshments. These barbarians, when they've met them, as will after appear, oh yeah, we haven't met the barbarian, right? He's stopping now and saying, look, our situation is really terrible, and then there are these barbarians, oh, you haven't met the barbarians yet. Well, you will see that. Now ask yourself, why does he break the chronology right there? It's not there in Mort's relation. It took them a while to find these people. They would see signs, but they don't find them for quite a while. What's the point of it? One of the things you can see is, again, it's as a rhetorical moment. He's stopping and taking stock. He's addressing the reader. And now he's going to break chronology. He's going to foreshadow their future meetings with the Indians. And he's going to foreshadow them in such a way that you already know how to interpret those Indians when you see them. What are they? They're barbarians. And they're worse barbarians than biblical barbarians, because the biblical barbarians gave the apostles succor. And these savage barbarians, when they met with them, as after will appear, were ready to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. Right? So again, you can see that one of the things that Bradford is doing is subtly manipulating the history too. Here, and it doesn't stop at that. Right? If you go back to this, you'll see that, what the land looked like. It seems like a pretty good place, full of natural resources. It's better than Holland. Like it, but much better. The earth is a spitz deep, excellent black earth. You can plant stuff here, right? Well, but for the season, he tells us here, in the history, it was winter, And they that know the winters of that country know them to be sharp and violent and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. And again, look at this, always the constant comparative logic. Bad enough if you have a map or you know where you're going, but look what we had to do. We had no idea where we were going. And besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? Again, on the date that he's talking about, he didn't know anything about the wild men. They hadn't really seen beasts, and he wasn't interested before when beasts. He was interested in all this good stuff. What's happened? What multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Because here we're going to get another moment of typology. Right? We'll get a biblical story. It'll be compared to the current situation, and the current situation will be not only fulfillment of that story, but it'll be a lot worse. Neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes. And the footnote tells you that that's the mountain where Moses could see the promised land. So he had some sense that the promises were about to be fulfilled. These guys have only faith. For whichever way soever they turn their eyes, telling a parenthetical, save upward to heavens. That's the only succor you're going to get, right up there. Can't look down here. The earth, forget it. Only God. Wheresoever way they turned their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country full of woods and thickets represented a wild and savage hue. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and was now as a main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. If it be said they had a ship to succor them, which is true, but what heard they daily from the master and company, but that with speed they should look out a place with their shallop where they would be at some near distance, for the season was such as he would not stir from thence till a safe harbor was discovered by them where they would be, and he might go without danger, and that victuals consumed a place, but he must and would keep sufficient for themselves in return. So don't look at a ship to help you. You've got to find your own stuff. We're going to levy you just as much. We're definitely leaving ourselves enough to make the ocean voyage back. We're not staying here. You guys are going to be on your own really soon, the captain is telling them. Yea, it was muttered by some that if they got not a place in time, they would turn them and their goods ashore and leave them. Let it also be considered with what weak hopes of supply and succor they left behind them, that might bear up their minds in the sad positions and trials they were under, and they could not be very small. And again, going back to the conditions in Holland. It is true indeed, the affections of love of their brethren in Holland was cordial and entire to them, but they had little power to help them or themselves. And how the case now stood between them and the merchants at their coming away hath already been declared. What could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and his grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, in other words, you who are reading this book, our fathers were Englishmen which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness, but they cried out unto the Lord, and he heard their voice and looked on their adversity. Let them therefore praise the Lord because he is good and his mercies endure forever. Right? And then he ends with this idea of the wonderful works of God. So you can see the logic of this. This is very Puritan logic, and it's typological thinking in action, this newish kind of typology, in which what you do is you look back to the Bible for precedent, and then you think of your own situation in terms of that precedent. It gives you some hope. But you also understand, and you might say, well, geez, but what is he doing? He's saying it's so much worse for us than it was for them. But again, with the logic of the Puritans, you would see that's the cause, in a funny way, for even more hope. Because God afflicts those worst whom he loves best. He gave the Israelites a hard time. He's giving us a worse time. He really took care of the Israelites. He's really going to take care of us. Why? Because we are living in New Testament time. Not only that, we are living in the fulfillment of New Testament time. Hence the final emphasis on God's grace, God's mercy. So that's Puritan logic for you, right? It's the same logic that goes from the covenant of works to the covenant of grace. Covenant of works, big fall. Then risen up to grace, end up in a higher place. Right? So that's the logic. It's worse for us, but better for us in the end. Just a couple of other things then. This is an example of the way in which one of the things that's going on is one of the things that's going on is a kind of heightened level of abstraction, right? If you go back here, you see that he's quite interested in certain details of the coastline. By the time you get to Plymouth Plantation, he doesn't care about those details anymore. It's all a hideous and howling wilderness. It's almost like everything that's actually there has got to be erased so that the Puritans can rewrite themselves onto their landscape, rewrite themselves and their story. So here's just a little moment, but again, it gives you the sense of it, right? This is from Mort's Relation. It's about a battle when they finally meet the Indians. One of our company being aboard came running and cried, "They are men, Indians, Indians," and with all their arrows came flying among us. Our men ran out with all speed to recover their arms, as by the good providence of God they did. In the meantime, Captain Miles Standish, having a snap hands ready, made a shot, and after him another. After they two had shot, other two of us were ready, but he wished us not to shoot till we take me. Okay, so it's a battle that's going on. And then we find all of this, right? We heard 3 of their pieces go off, and the rest called for a firebrand to light their matches. One took a log out of the fire on his shoulder and went and carried it unto them, which was thought did not a little discourage our enemies. The cry of our enemies was dreadful, especially when our men ran out to recover their arms. Their note was after this manner: "Woach, woach, ha, 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 woach." Our men were no sooner come to their arms, but the enemy was ready to assault them. Let's look at the corresponding passage of Plymouth Plantation. This is on page 119. So from the cry of our enemies was dreadful, here we get this. They cried. This is about 12 lines down the top of 119. "Men, Indians, Indians, with all their arrows came flying amongst us." Okay, so we got that. "Their men ran with all speed to recover their arms, as by the good providence of God they did. In the meantime, of those that were ready, 2 muskets were discharged at them, and 2 more stood ready in the entrance of their rendezvous." I don't think Standish gets a shout out in this one, right? He's here. But we're too busy for that. We got to make it more abstract here. "The cry of the Indians was dreadful, especially when they saw their men run out of the rendezvous towards the shallop to recover their arms, though Indians wheeling about upon them. But some running out with coats of mail on and cutlasses in them, they very soon got their arms and let fly amongst them and quickly stopped their violence." Right? Now look at the slight difference in that passage alone. The cry of the Indians was dreadful. No sense that they have language. Instead, they are simply crying out. They're kind of wheeling about, creating what seems to be a certain kind of chaos. And I told you Bradford was a linguist, but he wasn't interested in the native languages. And rhetorically, he becomes less interested when he comes to write the history of Plymouth Plantation. So that little phrase there is excised. And all the Indians do is get to have a kind of crying out. No sense that they were able to speak or communicate in any way. What's at stake here is in the creation of the Indians as a set of barbarians. And more than that, we might argue, a set of biblical type barbarians, worse than the biblical type barbarians. And you know what happens to barbarians in the Bible, you can get rid of them. God takes care of them for you, or he licenses you to take care of them. And that's exactly what happens. I mean, ultimately, the Pequot tribe is wiped out by these Puritans. And even their minister, John Robinson, who's back in Holland, writes to them and says, you might have converted a few before you killed them all, or you might have used that kind of time-honored method of killing their leaders and not everybody. And they basically write back and said, "Yeah, I had to be there." I mean, right? If you'd been there, you would have realized those were not options, just massacre, right? So they don't see themselves as missionaries. They're done with that. What they see themselves, and that's in some sense different from the Spanish in South America, who do have a sense of mission as well as a sense of murder, theft, and rapine. But there's no missionary impulse really amongst the Puritans, where it's really kind of submerged, and you see that here. They just simply are caught up in their own biblical drama, and they rewrite the history of the New World as a continuation of the history of the people of Israel and the Christians thereafter. Okay? So those are the things I want you to see about Bradford. How he uses this set of rhetorical devices. They have to do with typology. They have to do with a heightening of the abstraction of the New World, the transformation of the world of Mort's Relation, which is a world of wonder still, into a world of no wonder at all. A world of only savagery, barbarism, a wilderness that is howling and inhospitable. In some sense, you might say they erase what's there, sketch it all over in black so that their own light can shine out more brightly. That's the rhetorical thing that he's doing here. And it's very much in keeping with the kind, it's almost like a more hard-hearted version of what we see Winthrop is trying to do. There's a sense in which what comes across in Bradford in these particular passages is the darkness of the New World. Whereas Winthrop, so that's Bradford, Winthrop, in some sense, in a model of Christian charity, is trying to concentrate on the light. And the image that he comes up with at the end is an image that has everything to do with this idea of creating light in the New World. So let's take a look now at of Plymouth Plantation. But there are a few things I want to tell you about Winthrop and his Puritans as well. And I think you get a sense of this in that Berkovich article, which is called The Puritan Vision of the New World. But it's worth saying a few things more about it. The Puritans who came with Winthrop were more, to the extent this is possible, kind of middle-of-the-road Puritans. They weren't quite as doctrinaire as the Puritans who accompanied, who were part of the Pilgrims. And remember that the thing about Plymouth is that they actually tried an experiment in communal property holding, a communal property organization. When they started out, the land was held in common, and everybody was kind of shareholders in this. But property was going to be meant to be held common. They thought of it as a way of knitting people together more effectively. That is a kind of radical version of the way these joint stock companies that they belong to might be organized. And Winthrop's Puritans don't do that. They are much more interested in what we might think of as individual, the problems and rights of the individual. And that's one of the things that Winthrop himself has to combat as he is trying to give this sermon. So there's some things to know demographically about these people. Winthrop starts what's called the Great Migration. Right? So it starts in 1630, and this migration of Puritans to the New World takes about 10 years. And over that 10-year period, you have quite a few people coming across. I think the number is actually something like 10,000 before who come across with the Arbella to the New World, and in the aftermath. No, 20,000 follow Winthrop's group. And there have been demographic studies of what the people are like in this Great Migration. It's kind of interesting to think about it. 10% of the people were poor servants. I'll give you these figures in the post-lecture notes, which I will get up to date today. 10% of them were unskilled laborers and therefore lower class. The combination of aristocrats, children of aristocrats, like second, third sons of aristocrats, and complete underclass riffraff, together they only make up 1%. Right, so that's 21% accounted for. The rest of them, 79%, the bulk of these people were what were referred to as middling sorts. You might think of them as kind of middle class. They were artisans, tradesmen, shopkeepers, independent farmers. Not everyone who came with Bradford was a Puritan, but even those people who were Puritans weren't only rebels against a state of religious persecution. They were also seeking kind of economic opportunity in the New World as well. There was a study recently, or fairly recently, a study of the Puritans that was called Prophets in the Wilderness. And it was a pun, because most people would say if you said that title, you would assume they meant like biblical prophets with a PH. But it's prophets with an F. It's about economics. And then one of the things to say is that the Puritans who came were interested in both things. They were interested in getting ahead spiritually, or not being persecuted, and they were also interested in kind of getting themselves to have a better economic future. So they belonged to what was called joint stock companies. That means they were shareholders in this enterprise. They had to raise money also. It's not cheap to send boats across the Atlantic with supplies. So the idea was they created these joint stock companies. There were shareholders back in England. There were shareholders amongst the company themselves. They would come, they would farm, they would do everything else in the New World, they would send back stuff to England, and then profits would be made, and these profits would be shared. Right? So that's a sense in which they are part of an economic enterprise. It's how they fund their way across the Atlantic. And I think that's important to remember as a kind of context for everything that we're thinking about. Certainly it's the context of Winthrop's sermon. It's not just a sermon that's supposed to promote a set of biblical ideals. He's speaking to a very particular audience that has a particular demographic makeup, and he's aware of both their concerns and their tendencies. Now, one thing to say about sermons generally. The Puritan sermon typically will take this form. It'll start out with a biblical text, often very short biblical text. And then you'll get a section that's called the explication. You'll get a quick gloss on this biblical text, a quick interpretation of this biblical text. And then you will get a longer section that's called the doctrine, in which the larger doctrine behind the text and its explication is laid out for you. And then you will get what's called propositions and reasons. Sometimes it takes the form almost of a kind of question and answer session, in which different facets of the doctrine are explored, questions or objections might be raised and then gotten rid of. And then finally you'll get a section that's called application, right? In which you're made to understand why it is you've heard this particular sermon, why the message has been given to you. And that is the form of the typical Puritan sermon as it would be preached by a member of the clergy. Now, it may well be that the most famous sermon that comes out of Puritan America, which we read for today, is in fact atypical because it's not a church, it's not preached by a clergyman. It's in fact preached by a member of the laity. And it's therefore called a lay sermon. And one of the things we would say is that prominent people like John Winthrop were permitted to give sermons on certain events. And so Winthrop who becomes the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, takes advantages of this and gives this sermon. And I want to say a little bit more about the way in which the sermon works, because it isn't the same as other sermons. Let's take a look at it, therefore. It takes place in your book, it's page 147. It's called A Model of Christian Charity. And it starts off in this way. 1, a model hereof. God Almighty, in his most holy and wise providence, hath so disposed of the condition of mankind, as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Now, what immediately do you notice about that as a starting point? You can flip the page if you want. How does this structure that's given to you in the Norton Anthology map onto this structure that I've just told you about? What part is that I just read? Yes?
It takes the place of the biblical text.
That's right. It takes the place of a biblical text. There's no biblical text here. I mean, there is a biblical text. It comes out of St. Paul. It's a very famous one, actually. It's where he talks about, giving up childish things. And it's about charity in the original King James translation. Now we call it Paul's Hymn to Love. I'll give you an excerpt from it in the notes so that you can see it. But in the original King James, it's charity. So that's the text, but he doesn't cite the text. He could have. He could pick something else. He's done something different. He's given you, in lieu of a biblical text, he gives you a model. Now, it's being called a model of Christian charity. His audience probably would have thought, oh, well, if we're going to be talking about charity, we're going to be clearly going to Paul. That's the place that you would go. Fine. So why begin this way? God, in his most holy and wise providence, hath so disposed of the condition of mankind, as in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Now, if you take a moment to look at, here it is, the piece that I assigned to you from this book, which is this brand new literary history of America. It was kind of like one of Entertainment Weekly's top books of the year. It's gotten a lot of play for an academic book. But in a way, it's interesting because each of these essays that are in here, and I've given you a few to read in the course of the term, are about 2,500 pages long, which is a pretty short length for an academic essay. In fact, in a panel discussion, I kind of joked that for a certain kind of academic reader, this book makes good bathroom reading, if that's what you do. You can pretty much polish off 2,500 words relatively quickly. And they're meant to be sort of invitations to think about a text again. So this piece that I asked you to look at The City on a Hill, subtitle is John Winthrop Explains the Bonds of Community. It's written by one of his descendants, Elizabeth Winthrop. And if you look at it, in some sense, it's making an argument on behalf of Winthrop. Like Winthrop, the Puritans, the sermon have gotten a bad rep. Their meanings have been misrepresented. By the end of the hour, you'll see one prime person who's done some misrepresenting of the meanings of this sermon. And she really wants to bring back this idea, the kind of radical idea of a community that's formed in the bonds of love. And I would say to you, actually, that's still pretty much a radical idea, just presented that way. Emerson would later say that a state that's based on the power of love hasn't been tried yet. And you know, you look at our current state around the United States, and we don't love each other very much, do we? So maybe if we did, it would be better. Of course, there's a lot of other things that interpretation of this sermon and the Puritans is sweeping aside. I want to give you just one example of that. So when she talks about this on page 29, she says she's speaking direct, and I think it's good. It gives you a good, kind of vivid sense of the sermon and where it was preached. She says we don't know really where it was, but I think most scholars tend to think that this sermon was preached when they're on the verge of reaching land. So it's preached on the boat, which is called the Arbella. No, not Arabella, the Arbella. And he's telling them that, we're about to get there, so we need to talk, and this is what I'm going to say. She says, speaking directly to the diverse members of the expedition, Winthrop began his sermon by attempting to explain why God made all men different. And from these reasons, he argued, stemmed important implications for their new community. True enough. The first reason, according to Winthrop, was to hold conformity with the rest of his works, being delighted to show forth the glory of his wisdom and the variety and difference of the creatures. Okay, then. Diversity, then, is inherently superior to uniformity as a reflection of all God's parts. The second reason for diversity, Winthrop continued, was so that God, quote, might have more occasion to manifest the work of his Spirit, first upon the wicked in moderating and restraining them, so that the rich and mighty should not eat up the poor, nor the poor and despised rise up against their superiors and shake off their yoke. Let's stop there and see there's a kind of trick in the argument that she's making there. And since we are being self-conscious this term, we want to see works of advocacy and persuasion. What's the trick? There's one word that she's using here that is in some sense, the argument that she presents turns on it, but there's something slightly dodgy about it. Anybody? Take a look at it if you have it with you. I'll read it again. The second reason for diversity, Winthrop continued, was so that God might have had more occasion to manifest the work of his Spirit, first upon the wicked in moderating and restraining them, so that the rich and mighty should not eat up the poor, nor the poor and despised rise up against their superiors and shake off their yoke. Yeah?
Manifest.
It's what?
Manifest.
What's manifest?
Manifest.
So why would manifest be the trick word? Have more occasion to manifest the work of his Spirit. Okay, to me that doesn't seem entirely contradictory. I mean, part of what Winthrop does want people to do is say, he wants to show how our work should manifest God's providence. So this idea of manifesting is sort of making clear. I think that doesn't seem quite as problematic as other things. Yeah. Yoke. Yoke's a good word.
Are they talking about what's the definition of the word in that passage?
Of yoke?
Yeah, I mean, they're talking about.
It's what oxen have, right? You throw it off. In this case, the poor have it, and we don't want them to throw it off.
Well, I just kind of got the sense of like if yoke like an egg, like they're wearing.
Not yoke with an LK. It's yoke with a KE.
Okay.
Anybody else? Yeah.
If it was yoke, then and if it's talking about God being manifested through, I guess, the work of the people on earth,
Mm-hmm.
then it's not making sense of equality. Like it's not showing that it's like a common humanity as opposed to an aspect of slavery.
Okay, we're starting to get at something. We have this idea of stressing the common humanity instead of, it isn't quite slavery, but it is poor. Some people are definitely going to be mean, and that doesn't mean nasty. That means, low and in subjection. So you're not quite exactly enslaved, but you're not exactly free and to do everything else. So there's a sense of oppression there. Yeah?
It just seems kind of strange that the rich should not oppress the poor, yet the
Well, it could be a comfy yoke. You put a little velvet on it or pad it. It's not so bad.
But then, like, they should not throw off that yoke, so therefore they should.
Well, you need the yoke. And, I mean, somebody's got to work. Who's going to plow the fields?
I guess so, but like the yokes, and then there's like a master, so the master shouldn't slave with the boy, and the boy should not go against the master. It just seems like it just seems
Well, that's what Winthrop has done, you might say. He has a sermon that gets called A Model of Christian Charity, and he begins it with a defense of hierarchy. Some are born rich, and some are born poor. Some are born mean and in subjection. Some are born to rule. And that is not accidental. In fact, that's part of God's plan. Okay, the trick from my perspective is the way that Elizabeth Winthrop, describes what John Winthrop does. John Winthrop talks a little bit about difference here, differences among people, and he's thinking of differences of degree and rank. She uses a word that we all love these days if we're good multiculturalists. What is that word but diversity? She says this is about diversity, right? Diversity is inherently superior to uniformity as a reflection of all God's parts. And it helps her to make the argument that there's something good and worth reconsidering in Winthrop's sermon because, we all love diversity. Diversity is great. Look at us all around here. Look at your professor. He's brown. Isn't that great? Diversity. But he doesn't mean that kind of diversity. I mean, for him, that might have even been a radical idea. But there's the difference here. The difference here is not about cultural diversity. It's about economic difference. It's about social inequality. I'm sounding like Walter Ben Michaels now, but there's a famous argument that Walter Ben Michaels makes. At least one of you sort of heard him make it ad nauseum the other day, in which he says, look, we all feel that we're good progressive lefties if we support multiculturalism, but that does nothing to address social inequality or the real social injustice, right? If we're more diverse, it just means that proportionately there are more African Americans and Asian Americans in the top tier of society than there used to be. So great, 20% African Americans means, or whatever, would mean 20% among the rich, 20% among the middle, and 20% among the abject poor, but you still have the abject poor, you just feel better about them now. And what she is doing is in some sense getting away from the fact that one of the primary kind of diversity that he is defending is inequality, economic inequality. He's defending hierarchy. He's defending the organization of human culture into rich and poor. Again, in the context of a communal experiment that they knew to have happened in Plymouth, where there wasn't the same kind of economic diversity or inequality because people were engaged in a kind of communal property experiment, which didn't work. Why would you begin a sermon like this, which is supposed to be about charity, with a defense of hierarchy and inequality? A biblical, a divine defense. Why would you do that? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Well, if you're going to put everyone on the same ground, and you don't want to talk about hierarchy, and one might think there's no need for charity. Why should one be charity someone else? We're all on the same page. As opposed to in a hierarchical system, if you accept the fact, if you don't ignore the fact that you're an upper class or someone's an upper class, and you embrace it, you realize there are people of lower classes, and then that opens up possibility of charity. Charity to someone, to one in need, one less fortunate. So I say that there's hierarchy and supporting it in the Bible, saying it's not a bad thing. You shouldn't be afraid of it. You should embrace it, and in doing that, you should welcome in charity.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's part of what he's trying to get at. He says, in some sense, charity is good, and it's a good that we need to promote. It's a form of divine love, and it is more clearly necessary because of the fact of inequality. It means that it also, you might say, the rich realize that they have an obligation to be charitable. Because they are rich, because there are poor people who depend on them, there is a system of obligations in which the rich's obligation to the poor is clear. The poor also have a system of obligation, right? They understand that they owe something. They owe their labor. They need to work hard. So one of the things you might say is that inequality creates a kind of hierarchy that has a place of binding people together in a way that they wouldn't be bound together, this would be the logic, if they were all equal and didn't owe anybody anything, right? So what he's defending, you might say, is hierarchy because it's a system of obligation. Yes?
Well, I was just going to say that it seems also kind of like the second point he makes is like a rhetorical move intended to placate his audience, especially the rich, by indicating that yes,
it wouldn't be such a radical idea in that sense. I mean, it would have been familiar to them, right, from Paul's hymn to charity. They would understand that charity is an expression of divine love. One of the things he wants to talk about theologically is how this works, right? In other words, theologically, you shouldn't try to do anything about hierarchy. You shouldn't be upset about it because, look, God ordained it. It's the way God created the world. There are hierarchies of the animals. There's a lot of diversity in nature. Humankind should necessarily mirror that. And also it creates, as we see, this system of obligation. He actually is, what he is doing is taking a familiar, but even by now, metaphor from political science or political philosophy, which would be the body politic, and rethinking of it in Christian terms, in which the body politic of the Puritans is knit together, and he uses exactly this language, through the ligaments of Christ's love. Right? It's a body that's literally going to be knit together. And what knits it together? Christly love. What promotes Christly love? Inequality. That's the theological, the official version of the narrative. The unofficial version of the narrative, or the one that goes hand in hand below, is that it's a better way for this society to actually do what it has to do, which is to generate profits, if everybody is not upwardly mobile, looking to change their class position, looking too much out for themselves and not looking for the common good enough. Right? So one of the things that you might say is that what Winthrop is trying to do is harness the energies of what we might call a kind of incipient individualism. He wants to keep those energies because that will produce a certain kind of economic dynamism. Right? All the people these days who talk about the need to have a vibrant economy are making a belief on behalf of getting government out of the way and letting individuals and individual businesses do their own thing. The kind of laissez-faire capitalist model that Adam Smith will later on go to write the great philosophical statement about. Winthrop is in some sense wanting to maintain those energies, but he wants them strictly reined in. So one of the things that's at stake in this sermon is a particular notion that he's trying to create about the relationship between individual and community. And in his case, it's got to be community first, individual second. The individual has to subordinate himself or herself for the good of the community. The individual energies, we're going to pay attention to those, but they always have to be recognized to be part of this larger body. We are knit together in a system of obligation. And that works theologically, but it also has practical consequences. Not a lot, we don't want people worrying about making too much money and being upwardly mobile and lording it. We want to preserve things as they are. It's a message of conservatism, and you might say to keep, immediately they start. It's not a fresh start, in other words, right? You don't come to the new world. If you were a servant in the old world, you get to be a lord here and vice versa. You're bringing your baggage with you, and we're just going to set it up here, and we're going to make it all work. We're not trying to radicalize here in the new world. Is part of the message that he's setting across. If you look at the beginning of the sermon, on page 148, he talks about 2 rules. He says 2 rules, about the 4th paragraph. 2 rules whereby to walk towards one another. This is after he's talked a little bit about this system of obligation. Justice and mercy. These are always distinguished in their act and their object. It may both concur in the same subject in each respect. Sometimes there may be an occasion of showing mercy to a rich man in some sudden danger of distress, and of doing mere justice to a poor man in regard of some particular contract, etc. What's that? And then there's a second one, a double law by which we regulated in our conversation towards one another in both the former respects, the law of nature and the law of grace. So 2 things, justice and mercy, nature and grace, they are mapped onto what? Old Testament and New Testament. Right? Justice, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, Old Testament. Mercy, turn the other cheek. Love thy brother, thy neighbor as thyself. Right? Christ, in revising the Old Testament, keeps the top commandment, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other God before me, but changes several crucial things, particularly about the relationship between justice and mercy. The Puritans don't believe there's no such thing as justice when you're talking about your relation to God. You don't deserve anything. You get everything you get because God is merciful. Therefore, mercy is a higher value than justice. Justice somehow goes along with the state of nature. Mercy goes along with the state of grace. And the New Testament and the Puritan mission. Anything you can do, therefore, to produce mercy, the need to be merciful, is good. It's Christly. It's godly. So that's one of the things I want you to see that he's setting up. He's setting up sort of these interlinked things. He's mapping them onto the way in which the Puritans typically think about the Old Testament, the New Testament. He's mapping them onto the ways in which people think about type and antitype. And he's creating these interlinked ideas. Individual and community, we're going to put community first. Another one would be sort of materialism and idealism. And we might think of those in a double sense. The low sense of materialism is greed, right? You're greedy, you're materialistic. The low sense of being idealistic is you want to do good works or believe in so. That's part of it, I suppose. But really, there's a way in which this is also an attitude, what we might call philosophical materialism and philosophical idealism. It's philosophically idealist. That means it believes that the real truths in the world are not in the world at all and cannot be discerned from the world, but are only to be found above. The philosophical, and we'll go on, we'll talk more about this as the term continues, but for now let's just say philosophical materialism takes a look at the world and tries to reason from it, tries to find evidence in the world of various things, and uses the world as its evidence for making larger statements about the nature of the world, the nature of the divine, whatever. You might say, for those of you who know any philosophy, it's Aristotle looking around and seeing how things work. How do we do the poetics? How do we figure out how to write a good play? We see a shitload of plays and then we write about it. Socrates would have a wholly other different way of going about it. He would believe there are certain first principles, and we would try to discern what those should be by logic and intuition. In the Christian context, we would say the real world is undependable. Why? Well, what do we know about the real world? Or this world, the earthly world? I shouldn't use that term real. It's all depraved. As a result of the fall, the earth is depraved. You couldn't possibly derive truth from it. You need to look up there. St. Bradford, we couldn't see any, get no sucker looking here, straight or down, got to look up. Same thing for Winthrop. So therefore, what you're saying is, he wants to harness the energies of the individual to promote the communal good. He wants, in some sense, to start to think about materialism in both of its senses, but ultimately use any of those as a vehicle for a certain kind of philosophical idealism. So finally, we get at the end to the application of this, and I think it's worth looking at. The first part, which is longer, is full of references to the New Testament. The second part, the application, this starts on page 156, suddenly starts to get a little bit more preoccupied by the Old Testament. So up until this point, it's been very Pauline in its approach, ostensibly. It's about love to others. St. Paul the Apostle goes out and preaches a doctrine in which both the Jews and the Gentiles can be converted and saved. Those who are, he calls it, those who are circumcised and uncircumcised can find salvation so long as they come to the word of the Lord Jesus Christ. Paul is also famous for emphasizing Christ's sacrifice on the cross. But he does that because he sees it as the ultimate act of love. Right? It's not a form of discipline that he's interested in. He's interested in Christ was willing to suffer that because he loved us so much. That's a measure of it. And he suffered so much we can't even understand it. It's boundless. And that's why it can wipe out the debts of those who are, of everybody else who would come to see Christ. The Puritans should believe in a doctrine, therefore, in which the Jews and the Gentiles, the circumcised and the uncircumcised, they and the Indians, everybody can be saved, right? It doesn't quite happen that way. And part of the reason for that, I think you start to see here, they get fixated on the idea of themselves as the chosen people. So in the last part of Winthrop's sermon, there are many more references to the Old Testament. Take a look here, 157, right? He's talking about commission. He uses a language that seems somewhat Old Testament. He uses the language of covenant and somewhat 17th century or more modern, commission and contract. Those two are put together here. So he's talking about Saul being given a commission, indented upon him with certain articles. Okay, middle of 157, famous passage. Thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into covenant with him for this work. We have taken out a commission, so the biblical language, 17th century language. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw our own articles. We have professed to enterprise these actions. Upon these and those ends we have hereupon besought him of favor and blessing. Now if the Lord shall please to hear us and bring us in peace to the place we desire, if he gets us to the new world, he is ratifying this contract. He hath ratified this covenant and sealed our commission, and will expect a strict performance of the articles contained in it. But if we neglect the observation of these articles, which are the ends we have propounded, and prosecute our carnal intentions. And that doesn't only mean sexual. It means even has bodily, material, earthly intentions. Seeking great things, see, that's the gloss, for ourselves and our posterity, that the Lord will surely break out in a wrath against us, be revenged of such a perjured people, and make us know the price of the breach of such a covenant. Now the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, again, going back to the Old Testament, to do justly, love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, and here we get all the language coming together, this idea of knitting together. And you can look at the way the rhetoric quickens up, right? He starts to omit the subject of these sentences as he goes on. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must hold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make each other's conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes in community in the work. Our community as members of the same body. Right? If we do this, if we buy into this kind of idea of the ligaments of Christly love, something really good is going to happen. And that is this. We will become the glory of the Christian world, right? This is the idea of shedding light. When he shall make us, this is about 7 lines down on 158, when he shall make us a praise and a glory that men shall they say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider, and now he goes to a moment from the Sermon on the Mount, we must consider that we shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help for us, we shall be made a story and a byword for the world. Right? The stakes are higher. We are setting ourselves as this beacon for everybody. Everybody's looking. And if we screw it up, we will be that much worse off. We will be perjured. We will be a laughing stock. Worse than that, we will make Christianity a laughing stock. We will, as he puts it, open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the many ways of God and all professors for God's sake. So that's what's at stake here, right? It's again that same logic. It is harder for us because more is at stake. But in the end, we become this idea of the shining city on the hill. And that's why this sermon is thought in some sense to be a kind of blueprint for the community that they are trying to create. He's trying to get them to see how they need to behave in their social, their religious, their economic lives in order to make themselves keep their covenant and avoid being perjured. So one of the things that you would say here is that the first part of the sermon draws very heavily on Matthew and on the Pauline sections of the New Testament that are all about love. Paul is a great missionary, right? And these are missionary texts. But in the end, we get the city on the hill image from Matthew, but heavily contextualized by the language of the chosen people from the Old Testament. And it's that interplay that makes, you might say, Winthrop and the Puritans rein in the possibilities of love. Love, yes, but for us. We are not turning the other cheek. Now, one interesting thing to say about the city on the hill is it became very famous in the late part of the 20th century. It was revived as an image. And it was revived by this man. Does anybody know who he is? Good, I'm glad to hear it. The great communicator, right? I mean, the guy who was the populist. It's morning in America again. In 1980, everybody was just really, America was humiliated abroad. There was a terrible economy. Does this sound familiar? Reagan comes in and he says this. This is in 1977 after they've lost the White House. The preservation and enhancement of the values that strengthen and protect individual freedom, family life, communities and neighborhoods, and the liberty of our beloved nation should be at the heart of any legislative or political program presented to the American people. This is how the Republicans will revitalize themselves. Liberty can be measured by how much freedom Americans have to make their own decisions, even their own mistakes. The Republican Party, he said, must be the party of the individual. He's not, like Winthrop, putting the group first. It must not cater to the group. That's Democratic Party politics. No greater challenge faces our society today than ensuring that each one of us can maintain his dignity and his identity in an increasingly complex, centralized society. Then, with God's help, we shall indeed be as a city upon a hill with the eyes of all people upon us. So here's the symbol. He takes it from Winthrop, although for most of his career he doesn't actually credit Winthrop. But he uses it, and it's powerful. People are like, yes, the city on the hill. And what does it mean, the city on the hill? It's a city of free enterprise. can't sell out the individual to cater to the group, right? And there's a certain logic that he has in which you might say, if you pursue individual goods, you ultimately have this kind of ripple effect where you start to care about the family's good, the neighborhood's good, the church's good, the community, the state, the government, the national society, right? It kind of all builds on the idea of the individual. I don't have time to show you the speech that he would give, but it's kind of, maybe I'll do it next time. It's kind of worth, I'll do it at the beginning next time. It's worth looking at. But in his final speech, this is his last speech in 1980, the farewell address. I mean, people are watching this all over the country. People are weeping that this great president is like leaving the public stage. He says this: what Winthrop imagined was important because he was an early pilgrim, an early freedom man. He journeyed here on what today we'd call a little wooden boat, and like the other pilgrims, he was looking for a home that would be free. So far from taking up Winthrop's sort of subordination of the individual, Winthrop is turned into a cowboy, a rugged individualist, a freedom man, a frontiersman by Reagan. And I want you to bear this in mind. It's what happens to symbols as they circulate in a culture. Once you let it out, you can't control its meanings anymore. All right, we'll take it up from there next time.